let's talk about George Karl.
Well, let's set it up first. The Kings fired their coach a couple of nights ago, Mike Malone, out, which is kind of crazy because without DeMarcus Cousins, their star player, they're still 11-13, which for the Sacramento Kings is a pretty good record. But they decided to get rid of him, and this was the owner's doing. The owner felt the product was boring, and he wanted a more up-tempo offense. Consequently, George Karl's name is in the mix.
So two things are going on. George Karl, who is openly lobbying for the position, and this might be, I think he might. His name will be mentioned.
George wants back in badly.
Yeah, and certainly he doesn't want to work for ESPN. He wants to be back on coaching the floor, and he'd be good for the Sacramento Kings. He'll be good for any team because he'll up the tempo. They'll win more home games, and people keep writing me. Why don't they bring back George Karl? You and I talked about it. He and Josh Kroenke and the Nuggets ended on a bad note, and the Nuggets felt Stan Kroenke is still running that team, even though Josh supposedly is, that they could get somebody else for a lot cheaper and somebody who could do it a lot more effectively and get past the first round of the playoffs. So George's out there, he wants back in. But the other guy who actually is number one in line for the job is Chris Mullin, who was a star player for the Warriors forever, and the owner, besides up-tempo, likes what the Warriors are doing with Steve Kerr. He wants somebody kind of that's been a broadcaster, that's been around.
Yeah, I'd say the difference in talent is there's a big difference.
In terms of, well, explain that one to me, because I don't really get
the
it.
Golden State Warriors and the Sacramento Kings?
Oh, yeah. Well, I thought you meant talent of Kerr and Chris Mullin. Mullin played for the Dream Team. Steve Kerr didn't. So in terms of their playing ability, Steve Kerr's not a Hall of Famer. Chris Mullin was.
True.
He had a great 10, 12, 15-foot jumper. And he was one of the best players in the league for a period of time. He is, though, and you're probably aware of this, he is an advisor to the Sacramento ownership.
Yes.
So I think they're going to see and feel out him. But the general manager and the assistant general manager there both work for the Nuggets.
Right, the GM is
they would like to hire George Karl.
The GM is Pete D'Alessandro, who was the assistant GM here. He took the Kings job this past year.
And his assistant was also a lower echelon guy here.
Hey, for what it's worth, George Karl, as polarizing a figure as he can be at times, George Karl, 1,131 wins.
Yeah,
I mean, he's in the top, 8?
Yeah.
Top 8 all-time NBA, a 60% one-loss percentage. Playoffs,
Yeah.
Playoffs, he's 80 and 105.
Yeah.
And that cost him his job here.
He got to the finals once. He was in the playoffs every year. And people here, when he came in and actually got to the playoffs every year, people were kind of happy about that.
Yeah.
Then they got him to the 50-win level every year. Now people weren't so excited. We want more. Well, they got more. They went to
the Western Conference
Finals, and they could have won that. J.R. Smith screwed that up in like the first or second game. They could have won 2 games in that series in L.A.
against the Lakers.
And J.R. Smith threw the ball away. So people wanted more. We want to go and win a championship. Denver's never won a championship. Didn't even win one the last year the ABA and had all the talent in the world because they were only down to like 5 teams, and they couldn't beat the New York Nets and Julius Erving that year. So never had a championship here, I guess, unless you go back to the old AAU days at the downtown auditorium. The Nuggets, I think, made a terrific mistake there. They could have changed the parts, not the overall automobile.
All right, so what you're saying is, A, George is probably not going to get the Sacramento Kings job. You think it's going to go to Chris Mullin. And B, the Nuggets made a mistake firing George Karl?
Yeah, in retrospect, everybody knows that. I mean, is there anybody that would disagree that Brian Shaw's well,
it's not turning out that way.
Well,
but
I'm saying in retrospect. I mean, we're here. I can't, you and I are not going to time travel back to that day.
Why not?
We are sitting right here, and I'm saying, looking at it, it was a horrible mistake. Replacing Mike Shanahan with Josh McDaniels was a horrible mistake.
Yes.
One of the advantages we have by being alive, past events happening, is if we could go back in time, I wouldn't go back to the day they fired George Karl. I'd go to Dallas, and I would sit in a window and knock the hell out of the guy next to me so he couldn't shoot. That's what I'd do if I had a choice of where I'd go back in time. But if I could go back in time and had a lot of choices, I'd go back and say, Josh, this is a mistake. I've seen the future. So that was a terrible mistake. And I can sit here today and say it. He's a better choice than Chris Mullen. Mullen has been a coach in this league. He was an assistant coach. He's been a broadcaster. Probably good. But George Karl will go in and turn the Sacramento Kings and Pete.
Will he though?
He'll
in
turn
some
them
ways,
into,
and I like George, but in some ways,
they're
I'm
ahead
hoping,
of the Nuggets.
I'm hoping he doesn't.
They are ahead of the Nuggets right now, Les.
Woody, that is a lost franchise. It always has been. And
Sacramento?
And under this
Well,
new
then you
owner,
need-
it might always be. I mean, the guy is showing himself
But
to
wouldn't
be
you
as
think, though, if you have George and you have a general manager who came out of the Nuggets system under Masai Ujiri, and who, would we agree, Toronto is one of the best teams. They play in the
Right
Eastern
now it is, yeah.
Conference, but you know who's playing tonight? The two best teams in the NBA. Help me out. Who are the two best teams
Golden
in the NBA?
State and
21
Toronto.
and 2?
And Toronto?
No,
Golden State and help me.
Memphis.
And oh, that's right.
Would you
That's a
believe that
shocker.
Golden
Nobody's
State,
talking about Memphis.
Golden
Yeah.
State and Memphis are the two best teams? I guess that goes against the theory that NBA sort of maneuvers everything so the best teams are in New York, Chicago, and Los
Yeah,
Angeles.
that ain't happening this year.
Would you believe that three of the worst teams in basketball, I held up four fingers,
L.A., New York,
in New York?
in New York, yeah. But back to George. DeMarcus. I mean, how's he going to get along with DeMarcus Cousins, who's out with meningitis right now? But DeMarcus Cousins is the cornerstone of that franchise. He's the linchpin there right now. He's the star player. And
How's George gonna get along with
How
him?
is George?
How's Chris gonna get along
George
with
has
him?
had
Who
trouble
could
in
get
the
along with
past
him?
getting along with the star players. DeMarcus Cousins is a head case. I mean, a total head case.
All right.
And George is now going to have to rely on him to carry the team.
Sure, but-
and he's going to a city that's really it's a lost city in the NBA.
I'll let you
It's a
go off the
flyover
wall.
city.
Here's what you do. Come to me. You know, I was covering pro basketball when you were still a small child. You trade him.
You trade DeMarcus Cousins?
Of course, they've been
He's very
trying to
he's
trade
very
him.
tradable
So
right now.
Charlotte's out there looking to make deals. Michael Jordan wants to make deals. Michael Jordan loves problem children. He's had them. He played with a problem center at the end of his career in Washington. Who was that goof that was a first-round draft choice?
He drafted him.
Yeah, but he drafted some bad guys.
Yeah.
I'm telling you that there are people that would want Cousins. The Boston Celtics
Probably.
would want Cousins. So you can make a deal and get the kind of pieces that George Karl likes. He likes guys that hustle, and I know this is going to not make sense. Guys that play defense, guys that are team players. Cousins is not any of those things.
They could work a deal here.
Yeah.
You send a bunch of the Nuggets who played under George to Sacramento, get DeMarcus Cousins in return.
And then he gets Andre
Bingo!
Miller.
We just solved the problem. We just solved the whole thing.
We
Done.
We changed our places
Done.
in the